Have you ever had a character crisis so severe that looking at the character select screen started to feel more like trying to solve a murder mystery? Well, that's where I am right now, trying to learn BlazBlue Central Fiction. And while I was able to narrow it down to 2 characters, through combo trials, reading character guides, and watching match footage, I was still having a pretty hard time deciding which of the 2 characters I would prioritize learning first, to the point where it was actually getting in the way of me learning the game. And aside from asking the internet, or leaving it completely up to chance with something like a coin flip, I was fresh out of ideas for how to solve this character crisis. And that's when I remembered a technique shared by Anna of the psychology-centric YouTube channel Anna Psychology. A technique she calls the weighted checklist, which is, as she describes it,
a technique for indecisive people to make a decision about things that are just difficult for them to decide. So a lot of people self-identify as indecisive and just have difficulty making decisions in everyday life, things as small as like what to eat for lunch that day, as well as bigger decisions such as which career to choose. So I want to propose a very mathematical, very logical way of finding a decision that matches up to your values. So it's considering what's important to you. And so it's not like you have to go ask someone else to do the decision for you. It's really kind of putting numbers to exactly what it is you want and maybe have trouble quantifying in your head.
But before we solve my character crisis, let's get away from this stuffy and messy desk and go outside for a change. Would you look at that? Sun is shining, birds are chirping. This must be the great outdoors I hear so much about. I think we're even close enough to touch grass. Yeah, no, this is close enough. So Anna says that we start by making 2 scales. These scales will later be used to choose the values that will ultimately dictate our decision. And the first scale goes from -10 to +10, that being very bad to very good, with 0 being neutral and a few intermediary values. The second scale, which rates how important something is to us, will go from 0, being not at all, to 3, being very important. And we will return to these scales shortly. But for now, we're going to list some pros and cons for each of our characters, Amane and Susanoo. So starting with Amane, I wrote down a few things like, him being a zoner, having great mobility, and I also took note of his cool drill mechanic. But for you, if you don't know what you like or don't like about your character or what's good or bad about them, their Dust Loop page is a great place to look for that, as at the very top of characters' descriptions, there's actually a pros and cons chart, which is both succinct and descriptive, as it tells you why those things are considered pros or cons. And in fact, that's exactly what I did for literally all the cons for this list, as I don't know much about these characters at all. And really, you don't have to distinguish between the pros and cons in this step. We just need to write them down. So now that we have our pros and cons listed, we can start with the first scale that we made. And this is where we begin to think about how these pros and cons will factor into our overall decision, or how we feel about that character. So if, for example, we take a look at the first entry here, that Amane is a zoner, which, in addition to loving zoners personally, I know is an integral aspect of Amane as a character. He is a zoner. And that's an important point about the first scale, I think, is that when possible, the values should be focused on how important they are to that character, and not so much how important they are to you, which is something I failed to recognize when rating his drive mechanic, which simply put is a pressure tool that gets more plus and does more damage on hit and on block the more you use it, which I initially rated as a +1 because it's a pretty cool mechanic, but to me is not that cool. But objectively speaking, it is incredibly important to Amane as a character, as without it he actually lacks mix-up, but with it he doesn't need mix-up. In fact, he doesn't even need to hit you to be a threat, which again, being a zoner and an evasive zoner at that, that's a potentially frightening prospect. And to look at a con, he has pretty weak defense, as his fast Abari buttons are apparently pretty stubby, making it difficult for him to stop advances, especially on the ground. However, I gave this con a 0 or a neutral score, as having weak defense as a zoner is just kind of standard practice, and I would assume that if you play the matchup correctly, especially with Amane being, again, an evasive zoner, or a highly mobile zoner, I assume weak defense shouldn't be much of an issue in an ideal matchup scenario. And looking over at the Susanoo side of things, the first pro that I listed here is that he is easy, or that he has an easy game plan as well as easy execution. Something I notice is common in a lot of footsie-based characters, and that's also a style of play I like, and certainly can't hurt the character, so I gave that a +6 because it's pretty good. And also Susanoo apparently does pretty big damage, which I've rated at a +3 because obviously doing damage is good, especially for a footsie characters who I would assume can convert off of stray hits and whiff punishes pretty well, but also big damage in and of itself does not necessarily make a good character and isn't necessary to be one. That's why I gave it that +3. And for a con, Susanoo has a pretty large hurt box, which of course on defense opens him up to being fuzzied. However, based on tournament results and some tier lists that I've seen, it doesn't seem to be hurting him that much. So I gave it a -2. And because this con's kind of interesting, I listed that he's not really my aesthetic, because, well, he's not. I typically play smaller frame characters, and a lot of them being girls, and Susanoo is just this big, chunky guy, and I know that this is supposed to be more of an objective rating at this point, but it's kind of that in-between, right? Because how you feel about a character does ultimately impact how well you'll mesh with them. So I gave it a -3 because it is a con, but it's not the worst, and I don't hate the design. I just thought that was an interesting one to look at that sits kind of between objective and subjective. So having gone through those with our first pass, now we can go back through and rate those same pros and cons on the second scale, which is their importance to us as an individual. And I think, personally at least, this is purely subjective. With this scale, the value you choose will become your multiplier. So looking at that first one on Amane's side, him being a zoner, I love zoners. Zoners are certainly one of my favorite archetypes, tied only with the footsies archetype. So in this case, I'd already given this a +8 on the first scale, and I decided to give this a ×2 multiplier because being a zoner, while I love zoners, it's not essential. So I gave that a ×2, which gives us an overall value of 16 for this pro. And if you'll recall the chip damage drill mechanic, which I initially gave a +1, but I feel that's incredibly important to, or good for Amane as a character, so I bumped that up to a +9. However, again, to me, it's just not that important, so I gave it a ×0 multiplier, so that ended up balancing out anyway to a 0. And I spoke on his defense earlier, which I gave a +0 because I don't think it impacts the character that badly, and, well, doesn't matter to me either, because I'm used to that with zoners, so that also ended up coming out to a 0. So I did the same thing for all the pros and cons on this list, and we can take a look at some of Susanoo's. So him being pretty easy, I like it, but it's not that big of a deal to me. Initially I gave it a ×2, but I'm indecisive, obviously, but I ended up settling on a ×1 multiplier because I like that he's easy. I don't mind easy characters, but they don't have to be easy for me to play them. So that's a ×1 multiplier, which gives us a 6 overall. I also talked about his damage earlier. Felt that was pretty good, but not everything, and similarly I don't really care that much, so I gave that a ×1 multiplier, which gives us 3 overall. And I guess we can talk about the aesthetic one, which I initially gave a -3 as it is impactful, right, but not like ultimately doesn't mean much in the grand scheme of things, and I feel that way personally as well, not that important. So I gave it a 1, which overall gave me a -3 for that value. So I did the same exact thing for all of the pros and cons in this list and added up the results. And the final numbers are 43 for the lovely mobile zoner Amane, and for the simple, big damaged, chunky buttons, chunky design, footsies character, Susanoo, 61. So Susanoo is our winner, which is honestly surprising to me because Amane is a mobile zoner, which is exactly what I love about Matera, one of my favorite characters of all time across all fighting games, and in fact they have a lot of the same mechanics and similar animations. And I initially wrote that down as a pro in and of itself, the Matera function, but I ended up crossing that out as it seemed redundant, and I guess if you really think about it, Matera is the Amane function of Grand Blue Fantasy Versus. And having considered all that, while I thought the decision was pretty close, I felt like I was just a little bit more leaning towards Amane, but based on the hard numbers, Susanoo is the very clear victor here. So all in all, I'm very happy that I found that technique and decided to use it, as it made a decision between what I thought was 2 equal choices very easy. You technically made it for me by taking my personal values in conjunction with some objective pros and cons and translated that into clear, hard numbers. And I'm of course very grateful to Anna for sharing that technique in the first place, and I'd actually recommend you guys watch her original video as she demonstrates how you can use this technique for some more complex, weightier decisions in your actual life. And I know personally that me as a player and as a content creator, I very much appreciate the overlap between fighting games and real life. I feel like you can learn a lot both ways, and this is a perfect example of that.